There's been kind of this secular student fellowship community that's been growing up on the campus, and they decided this year that we would try to do some public events, and this is the first one of them, so we're really grateful for you coming out. Dan and I are going to talk about Bernie Sanders. Yes, I knew that would thrill some of you. Although I am at great pains to tell you that this is not a Bernie Sanders rally. So if some of you were hoping for that, I think there's one next door that you can go to afterwards. But we're going to have a conversation about Bernie Sanders, about secular humanism, about religion and American politics. And we'll talk to each other for a while. This is an unmoderated conversation. We're going to be moderating ourselves. And then we'll talk for a while, and then after about 40 minutes, we'll stop talking to each other, and we'll see if you guys want to chime in with questions or you want to kind of keep the conversation going, okay? So without further ado, Diane.
Yes.
Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders is a phenomenon in American politics. And while this isn't a rally, I'm sure there are a lot of people out here, and particularly young people, because he seems to be attracting young people, who are kind of fascinated by Bernie Sanders as, in some sense, not just a political phenomenon, but also as kind of a moral leader, as somebody who's standing up and saying, there's something profoundly wrong with this country that I want to address. And in some sense, there are some of us that would say that what's fascinating about Bernie Sanders is that he's cast himself as kind of this moral leader, this guy who's running a campaign on principles and ideas and getting money out of politics and all these things. And yet, he's the only candidate of all the candidates in the race that you can characterize as openly secular. I mean, he's Jewish, but he's very clear, I'm a secular Jew. Like, I'm not a religious guy. And so my question for you is you've studied and been part of, in some ways you've studied religion and media, and in other ways you've been religion and media. You were a working journalist and all that stuff. You've been around this whole politics thing for a long time. And I guess what I would just ask you to start out with is, could you set Bernie and this presidential race, and religion in this presidential race as far as we've gotten, in some kind of historical context? Can you, where does this fit into the big picture?
As an historian, I love to shatter people's thoughts that everything is happening for the first time. So as I prepared today, I began reading about another candidate who ran for president, and he was called an enemy of Christianity, an infidel, a howling atheist. It was said that if he was elected, women would be raped, men would be murdered, the Bible would be destroyed, degeneracy would run rampant in our country.
Who was this horrible person?
Have I scared you?
Yes.
Does anybody know who this horrible person was? Teddy Roosevelt, much too recent. Thomas Jefferson, the election of 1800. 1800. Jefferson was being assailed by the press and by the preachers of his day for being an atheist. That was a big campaign issue that year. And you know what? Jefferson won that year. So not only have atheists run for president, they have won in this country. So that's the first thing that's important to remember. The other thing I'd say, to put this in context, you look shocked.
Well, I guess what I'm wondering is, so everyone's assailing him as an atheist, and what was his response? Did he go yeah, I am an atheist. I'm a godless guy, or did he go oh no, haven't you seen my Bible? The one I chopped up and made for myself.
Does everyone know what Bart is talking about? Jefferson, he wasn't an atheist actually; he was a deist, and which is
an important distinction.
Right. He believed that a God created the world and then just stepped away and removed him or herself or itself. And he thought Jesus was a prophet. He didn't think Jesus was the Son of God. Yeah.
No, that's what I'm saying. Is the people that called him an atheist got him wrong. Guy had some supernatural stuff going on.
But he didn't, because he really did not believe that there was a God
who intervened.
And he didn't believe that Jesus was divine.
But and when I talk about the Bible of his, Jefferson very famously took the Bible and with a razor blade sort of cut the parts out of it that he thought didn't make any sense.
Which were the supernatural parts.
Which were, okay, I'll give you that. I was going to say I'll give you that, but that's actually true. I'm not giving it to you. But he created this Bible that he thought was like, this is the legit stuff.
Yes.
Yeah, the Jefferson Bible.
Yeah, and so you could say he was a secular humanist in a sense, because he was affirming the teachings of Jesus and the prophets. He just wasn't buying the supernatural. And what he said to his friends, basically, this is not how Jefferson spoke, and I'm going to speak very contemporarily to you. He's basically like, these guys are full of shit, that, this is the best they can come up with, this is how they're going to attack me, it doesn't make sense.
Yeah, I mean, the whole founding of our country, in a sense, like our Constitution and everything, there was this kind of very deliberate attempt to, keep religion out of politics.
And Jefferson had a lot to do with that.
Yeah. And so, I mean, in some sense, you go what's old is new, but in between Jefferson and now, there's been a heck of a lot of religion in politics.
Well, except, again, I think it's newer than you think. Politicians have always invoked religion to get something done, to inspire people, to help change policy, to, make people want to go to war. But basically, it's only been in the last 30 or 40 years that we've had these zealously religious presidents who, invoke religion every 20 seconds and talk about putting God in public policy. It's only really since, Jimmy Carter began the trend because he was elected as an evangelical, and Southern evangelicals thought he was going to fulfill their agenda, which at that time was repealing Roe versus Wade, returning prayer to school, supporting Christian academies so that kids could be segregated in their educational experience. Carter let them down, so after that, they began looking for an alternative. But it wasn't until Nixon got elected that really this kind of focus on God and religion took hold. Nixon was the first president who said, God bless America. Before then, presidents didn't end their speeches saying, God bless America. Now you always hear them saying, God bless America. You probably thought they'd been saying, God bless America since Washington. But really, it started in 1973, and then it didn't really take hold till Reagan tried it again in 1980.
The whole rise of the religious right and all that.
Well, just saying, God bless America. I mean, when they say God bless America after every speech, I'm not crazy about it. Are you crazy about it?
I'm not at all crazy about it.
Right.
I mean, it's funny, and some of you probably know this about me. I spent 30 years as an evangelical Christian, and I wasn't crazy about it then. It seemed odd to me that, especially in a country as pluralistic as this one, that the president would sort of, would kind of come down there. But the other thing that seemed odd to me was, it seemed like a very clear evoking of supernaturalism, like that there's a God out there and he likes our country. And that just seems like but what you're saying is you feel like that's a fairly recent phenomenon.
Yes. Well, there are two different things here. For a long time, Americans have felt that God likes their country best of all. That's American exceptionalism, and that's sort of been around since the Puritans landed as sort of a basic part of the American ideology. That's different, though, than having a president who every other second says, we need to, do this because God wants it, or we need to do that because God wants it, or we need to restore prayer in school, or we need to stop abortion.
So are you saying a candidate like Bernie Sanders? Because, I mean, and the interesting thing about Bernie Sanders is that he's a secular Jew, which, it's funny because I grew up in evangelicalism, and the idea of being a secular Christian, or secular, there's no such thing as a secular evangelical. Because believing in God is central to being an evangelical. If you don't believe, you're not one. But Judaism has this long tradition of, you don't necessarily need to believe in God, you're part of the culture. So somebody can be a cultural Jew. So like Bernie Sanders shows up as a cultural Jew. Are you saying like, oh yeah, this is actually just a return to the early days of America?
Well, I'm not saying it's a return to the early days of America because a Jew would never be running for president in the early days of America. I mean, there were religious tests that made it possible. Jews were not allowed to even vote in some states until the 1800s. So no, it's not a return. But this idea that you could be president and
not be putting out anything religious.
Well, he puts out religious stuff. He's very prophetic. So, I mean, I would say a secular Jew is still imbued with that sort of Old Testament kind of sense of righteousness and justice. He could be. He doesn't have to be, but he could be, and Sanders is.
Yeah, I mean that's an interesting thing because and maybe I don't know if I mean I know you're aware, but like the Pew Foundation puts out these polls of American religious life, and you probably follow them religiously. But they always sort of desirability in a presidential candidate, and I think the thing I find interesting about Bernie Sanders is, and I don't want to say this in this room with any degree of it. We were talking to people on Tuesday about Bernie Sanders. Like, what do you think of Bernie Sanders as a candidate? And I don't know how many of you, what do they call them? Burners? Are you? Yeah, so I know there's at least a few burners in the room. And I don't know if you're aware of this, but a lot of people love Bernie's ideals, but they don't think he has a chance.
But they're beginning to as he's catching up.
Yeah, because he's catching up on money.
He's also catching up on numbers. Like I just read in California today, his numbers are going up and numbers are going down.
Yeah. So as Bernie, like the interesting thing about Bernie is that when people lay out their negatives on him, a lot of times they say, he's a socialist. A socialist, even if they love him, they go like, a socialist can never be elected president in this country.
But 47% of Americans say they would vote for socialists.
What's interesting is that's true. But like socialists is down on the Pew list. They're way down.
It's the lowest one of all.
There's only one low.
No.
Oh yeah, that's right. It's the lowest one.
Yeah, atheist is above.
Atheist is just above. Now the thing I find interesting about Bernie is, if people say he can't win, they say he can't win because he's a socialist. But I haven't heard anybody say he can't win because he's an atheist. It's not an issue. Now when Carter ran for president, you couldn't there's no atheist that could win that election. There's no atheist that could beat Reagan. There's no atheist that could be in the race against Bush. Obama even had to be like, I'm a church guy, If Bernie loses, it won't be because he's an atheist.
No, it won't be.
I think that's significant. I think that's a change. It may not be a change from 300 years ago, but it's a change from 20 years ago.
Well, I think it's a change that reflects a lot of dissatisfaction with the religious right. I think a lot of people have been turned off by the way the right has politicized religion. And I think it also represents changes that you all are more familiar with than I am. I mean, lots of you probably did not grow up in religious homes, or you grew up in homes where your parents had different religions and you were exposed to both of them. I mean, people have a much more fluid idea of religiosity. And just like there are secular Jews who do not want the religious part of Judaism but want the ethical teachings, there's a really fast-growing number of secular Catholics. That's a very big growing percentage of people who, they don't like all the religious stuff, but they love the teachings of the church. And those are the people who are flocking to Pope Francis.
Yeah, and interestingly enough, Bernie is flocking to Pope Francis. I mean, that's one of Bernie's big sort of like, I don't know if he's throwing out olive branches or if he's just trying to identify himself, or if he just sees Pope Francis talking about income inequality and he goes, hey, that's my issue.
For climate change.
Yeah, he's aligned with the Pope, and he's openly aligning with the Pope, which is kind of interesting for this secular candidate to be openly sort of praising the Pope and saying, I'm down with that guy. The interesting, here's the thing I want to put out to you and put forward is, right now in the poll, it's like, it's socialist is the least electable. Atheist is the second least electable. I think Muslim comes right above that. Here's my suggestion is that if they change the word from atheist to secular humanist, the electability goes way up to the middle. I think there's a whole new understanding that Bernie represents, and this would be my thesis statement if I had one, is that Bernie represents not anti-theistic, hardcore science saying God is a stupid idea and if you believe in him you're silly. But Bernie represents secular humanism and says, look, I don't believe in God, but I'm imbued with a serious set of values. And I even think religious life, congregating together, pushing moral values, teaching our children things. I think Bernie's sort of maybe what Ursula Goodenough would call a religious naturalist, in the sense of he doesn't think that there's anything other than than nature. He doesn't think there's any life beyond this one, but he thinks that this life has a sacred quality to it, and he talks about it in those terms. So what I think what's changing is, it used to be that if you were secular, people said, oh, you're a secular anti-theist. But now there's this new category that I think a lot of the students on this campus, like the Secular Student Fellowship group that I'm involved with, I think they represent that. But in the broader world, the Sunday Assembly people, these are people that are we don't want to fight with religion. We just want to pursue values in a secular way. And so, I think that's politically significant because it creates room for people who felt like they had they had to align with the religious folks if they wanted to represent values. Bernie says, I don't need to claim any supernaturalism to give you a case for my values. You don't think that's significant?
No, I think it's significant. It's sort of wresting the term secularist away from the religious right. Because when I covered the religious right in the 1980s, calling you a secularist was like calling you a dirty name.
Like a communist.
Yeah, it's like calling you a horrible name. So the fact that secularist no longer has that connotation of communism, baby killer, homosexual, and so on, and feminist, and so on, is a good thing. I mean, it's good that secular humanist has been retrieved. Now if we could retrieve the word religion, we'd be in much better shape. Because...
What do you mean by that?
This is not your issue, but it's my issue. The religious right and the news media has everyone convinced that if you're religious, you're a nutcase. You're a right-wing nutcase. And it's partly because the news media focuses in on those people because they give good quotes and they do crazy things. So the voice of religion in America has become the right wing. Now there are many religious people who don't share those values, and Francis is a good example, and he's gotten media attention because he's the Pope. If he was just a preacher here in LA, they wouldn't be covering him. So my gripe is that there are also religious people who have good values, but you would not know it from reading most of our news media.
That's interesting. I mean, what's interesting is, here at USC, I have an office in the building of the Office of Religious Life. I'm considered a religious director here. And you go, you're totally secular, you don't believe in God. That's true. But I belong in that department because the Department of Religious Life at this university is organized around not supernatural belief systems, but ultimate questions. So basically the Dean of Religious Life says, oh, are you asking where do we come from? What happens after we die? What makes for a good life? Is there any meaning in life, and where does that meaning come from? And yeah, that's the stuff we talk about at Secular Student Fellowship meetings all the time. That's the stuff I preach about when I'm at a big gathering. And he goes, oh, then you're a religious leader. So in a sense, what you're saying is religion right now is only ascribed to hyper-supernaturalists, but also
religious
cranks.
Political conservatives.
Political conservatives.
And I think people like Dean Stoney and you are doing a job, not you because you're not considered religious, but there are people who are trying to show that being religious does not necessarily mean you're a right-wing individual. But I think the term has just fallen captive.
And you know, when we get back to, and I think there's some political science type people here, when we get back to that, like, what I would say is that that's a really important point for politics, because not only was I a evangelical Christian for 30 years, but my dad is still a really prominent evangelical Christian leader. And when Bill Clinton was president, which was that before you were born? You know, like, it's funny, like, it doesn't seem like that long ago to me that we had Bill. But it was a long time ago. But when Bill Clinton was president, many of you may not be aware of this, he got in some trouble. And when he got in trouble, he had to cover himself religiously. He had to call in the pastors. And he had these pastors come to the White House to pray with him every week as he was rehabilitating his image. And my dad was one of those pastors. My dad became like Bill Clinton's like personal minister for a number of years. And they still hang out, which is kind of interesting. And actually, I told him I was going to have this conversation with you, and my dad was at the Clinton Global Initiative about a week ago, and he was talking with Bill about this whole thing. And Bill said, you know, you should tell your son. You should remind him how important you were to me when I was president. And I'm thinking, like, yeah. Like, but what Clinton meant was, he said, it turned out that when Clinton would have speeches to make, he would send them to my dad and ask him to imbue them with religious...
Doesn't that bother you?
Language, yeah. To imbue them with religious language. Now, what he didn't want was, he didn't want Bible verses. He didn't want Christianity. He wanted phraseology that suggested spirituality. Now, Obama's great at this too. I mean, if you see Obama at the funeral of the people in South Carolina, Obama doesn't say, he's not invoking God to really do anything, but he's speaking in language, prophetic language.
But see, this is why I think people like Bernie and didn't like Clinton so much, because no knock on your father, he needed your father to put that religious language in there. When Bernie was at Liberty University, he pulled out his Bible and started like waving around and talking about it.
It wasn't his Bible, it was somebody else's.
Okay. But it was somebody, but I mean, he knows that he may not be religious or spiritual, but those teachings are core to his value system.
What Bernie is often quoted as saying, and this, I think this is actually helpful to those of us that are trying to figure out how to relate in this kind of pluralistic environment. What Bernie often says is he'll say, look, I want to talk about income inequality, okay? Big issue for Bernie. It's just like, there's the ultra-rich 1% and everybody else struggling, and Bernie's horrified by that. When he was at Liberty, and when he goes to other places, he says, your religion teaches this. All religions teach this. And so he ends up saying to people, I'm just asking you to live up to your own values. Which is a very different thing. Like, he's not saying God calls, like George Bush would have said, God calls us to. Or we are called by our Creator. Like, in a sense, sort of invoking religious dogma. Bernie doesn't do that. Bernie just goes like, hey, doesn't your religion say something about this? Shouldn't you care about this on the basis of your own thinking? That's a shift.
Yeah.
I love that shift. Because in a sense, he's kind of, and Obama, I think, has done a similar thing. I was talking to Dean Stoney, and he said that he feels like President Obama is the first interfaith president. And by that, what he means is that Obama doesn't privilege any faith. I don't know if you know this, but like, unlike every other president in recent history, Obama hasn't selected a church to go to and to sort of like, look at me on Sunday morning, I'm going into church for the photo op. He doesn't go to church. And he doesn't claim, he's kind of fairly universal. And he's the first president in my memory that in speeches would say, we're a country of Jews and Christians and Catholics and Muslims and non-believers. Yeah. He says it straight up. He's like, look, and when he's invoking our moral fiber, there's this new category that says, oh, you're secular. And that's what you base your morals on? That's a new ballgame.
Well, did any of you hear Obama on the Mark Maron podcast? Oh my God, you guys got,
Do you guys not listen to Mark Maron? Do you even know that there is a Mark Maron podcast? I thought I was hip for listening to Mark Maron. Seriously. Okay, have you heard of Louis C.K.? He's a portly comedian. Okay, Louis C.K.'s best buddy is this guy Mark Maron, or it used to be, and they had to. In fact, if you go to your Google, did I say that wrong too? Yeah. Okay. Google best podcast of all time. Slate Magazine did it, and the #1 podcast was Louis C.K. reconciling in friendship with
Mark Maron.
Mark Maron, who then later, after interviewing Louis C.K., interviewed
Obama. Did you hear that interview?
Yes,
okay.
It was brilliant.
So the quote I love. You have to go listen to it because it's like a side of Obama you don't really hear that much. And Mark Maron asked him about his mother, and Obama says, I always called her the last of the great secular humanists. She thought all religions had something to say, and she thought all cultures were fascinating. She instilled in me these core values that for a while I thought were corny. And then right around 20, you start realizing that honesty, kindness, hard work, responsibility, looking after people, they're actually pretty good values. And when I heard him say that, when I heard the podcast, it was like he called his mother a secular humanist. You could not have done that 20 years ago. And, maybe he's just doing it because he figures none of his enemies listen to Mark Maron. But
he called her a secular humanist, and he defined, and he said, that's why she gave me such great values.
Yeah.
Like that's where her values came from. Not that it wasn't like she was secular and she also happened to be a good person. He was like her goodness, her moral values grew out of her secularity. I was talking with a student today, and basically, he was sort of asking me, what is this whole thing about that you guys are doing? And I said to him, the bottom line is, I'm pretty sure that when I die, I'm dead. I think this life is the only life that I have. And that urgency, the urgency that says, I don't have eternity, this is it, creates this need to connect with other people. And the idea is, how do you make a good life? How do you make the most of this one short life that you have? And I was sort of I think I'm going to die, so this is all I have. And then I studied up on, who seems to have the best life, the most well-being, who seems happiest in their life. And it's not people who make the most money or have the most power or have the most sex or use the most drugs. It's people that have the most loving relationships and that do work with their lives that they feel makes the world a better place. And so what I was saying to him is all my morals flow out of my absolute conviction that there is no God and that this life is the only one I have. That's what they're intellectually founded on. And that's what Obama was saying about his mom. It's not that she happened to be a good person who didn't believe in God, but that her goodness in some sense was based on not believing in God, in the same way that we're all familiar with Christian and Catholic and Muslim and Jewish people whose goodness is based on the fact that they do believe in God. That that's where their goodness is grounded. So I feel like we joined, when Obama said that, I was like, oh my gosh, we've joined the club. We're in.
Yeah, it's true. And I think this is something that psychologists are doing research on too, which is, can you be good without God? And why is there such a prejudice in America, especially that you can't be good without God?
Okay, now here's the thing. We've been talking for a half hour. I've got a list of fascinating things for us to talk about. And we could talk all night. But I'm thinking that probably there's some things that you would like to talk about or that you'd like to add to the conversation. So maybe now would be a good time to throw you in. And then we may cut you off and then finish up for 5 minutes. But let's jump in now and make it a group chat. Go for it, brother in the back. Yeah, you.
I'm Catholic, but I'm not a priest, so you can't call me once again. My name is Phillips. I am a member of the religious right. And I would just like to, I don't have an argument, I just have a couple historical points of clarification. So we mentioned that this whole religion and politics thing didn't really start up in start up as a big thing until 30 or 40 years ago under the Carter and Nixon presidencies. But as a big fan of 19th century American politics, I can assure you that the speeches of Andrew Jackson, Abraham Lincoln, Theodore Roosevelt, and everybody in between are littered with all kinds of stuff. We stand at Armageddon and we battle for the Lord, with malice towards none and charity for all, firmness of the right as God gives us to see the right. I could go on, I could go on, I could go on. And just as in contemporary, relatively secular on one side and relatively religious on the other side, American political discourse has certain moral norms and certain ideas about what makes something right and what makes something wrong, just as those are constructed in the way that they are. Over the wide course of American history, even in the days of Thomas Jefferson, this isn't saying America is a Christian nation, but there's been a general penchant for religious extremism in political discourse as a way to make ideas legitimate. And so I'm not saying that Jefferson, Lincoln, and Roosevelt would have approved of what Billy Graham does, but I think it's a far cry to say that we haven't had this kind of religious discourse in American political life to the degree that we have. And again, I could go give you guys as many examples as I like, but I just severely, severely contest the notion that religion has been a minor part in American political life and political discourse.
I'm sorry if that's what you heard, and I'm sorry if I misspoke. Religion has been a very big part of American religious life, and religion and politics have been working in tandem since this country began. What I meant to say was that the kind of culture war, vicious religion and politics we have today, where religion is used to undercut and undermine people, is a product of the last 30, 40 years. And although presidents have always invoked religious language to motivate people, I don't think in the past they did it as much to alienate people and to force people in some sort of unpleasant confrontation.
I think the other thing is that at the time period that you're talking about, I think if you polled America and said like what percentage of America would identify as Christian, it would have been like this huge preponderance. And so like it was just political good sense and also just motivational good sense. Like if you all are USC Trojans fans, like when I'm a speaker, like I drop a Trojan reference in there because like I'm with you, you're with me. And so I think you could now, you know, as the tenor of our country changed, I think the ability to do that was different. Then when you come back, you get around to like religious right, like Reagan, moral majority stuff. What's weird about that is that then when you're speaking to the evangelical Christian right, you're not speaking to the whole nation anymore. You're just speaking to the part of the nation that votes and gives money to campaigns. And has, you know, and so in a sense, it's a very divisive thing. It's going like, you know, Karl Rove, not a deep Christian man, but he knew how to work that. He knew how to work that constituency. But he wasn't talking to the whole country the way that like that quote of yours. That wasn't Karl Rove. Who was that you were quoting?
Which one? One that was Theodore Roosevelt, the other one was Abraham Lincoln.
Yeah, I think that those guys, the America that they were talking to, almost completely spoke that language.
The other thing is that Lincoln, interestingly enough, was one of two presidents, the other being Eisenhower, who never joined a church. And I mean, he to me was almost Sanders-like in his ability to use religious language to unite people and inspire them. You know, you're right, it's a subjective determination on my part, like who uses religious language to unite and inspire and who uses it to divide. And I thank God for the evangelicals who used religious language, I thank God for them, who used religious language in the 19th century, because they were doing things like, you know, passing laws against prostitution, they were doing moral reform work, they were trying to end child labor, they were trying to end slavery. So, you know.
And of course, religious language is good for both. You know, it's good to enslave people, and it's good to liberate them. You know, it's good to subjugate women, and it's good to liberate women. You can use religious language for anything. Like, there's something there for you. You know. So, but what's interesting is I really appreciate your point, because I think that that's one of the interesting things about the changing landscape of American politics, is that religious language works differently in a pluralistic country. And I think like one of the biggest questions, and we haven't touched on this, is Islam. We'll come back to that in just a moment. But you had a question, like jump in.
Yeah, kind of forgot with the discussion.
That's okay.
But let me add one anecdote to what he said. There's no doubt that religious has always played a big part in politics. The election of 1800 you quoted, I remember seeing an ad paid by a super PAC associated to Huckabee in 2012. It didn't refer to Obama by name, but basically it presented like the future of our civilization is in danger. And it showed images of hell, and it implied that if Obama was elected, there was going to be a disaster for civilization, morals, and all of that. And I found a speech by a pastor or priest, I don't remember, from 1800, saying the same thing about Jefferson. What seems to me different is that in the times of Jefferson, those who pursue and attain power, like Jefferson himself, were very clear about what Jefferson called the wall of separation between church and state. And you said like the last 40 years, I would go back to the 50s, and not because I'm a historian, it's because just that's the closest reference I got. If you read Why I'm Not a Christian by Bertrand Russell, the editor, whose name I don't remember, at the end he tells about how Russell, with all his recognition and his fame, was denied a faculty position for being an atheist in the 50s or before, I don't remember, in New York. I don't remember which university. And the point is that if you read this essay, it was written in the 50s, you get the feeling that the phenomena of religion becoming more and more embedded in the political process was something new in the 50s.
That's interesting because there's a new book about that by Kevin Cruz called In God We Trust.
Mm-hmm.
And the
Kevin
book,
Cruz, you said?
Yeah, Kruse. And his theory is that because corporate America was concerned about the liberal drift that had begun under Franklin Roosevelt, in other words, the creation of the welfare state and the New Deal, they worked to rally clergy people who agreed with them that the country was taking a socialist turn and it should use every means possible to move away from that. And one of the ways they thought they could do that was to remind people that being an American was different than being a communist, and communists wanted welfare, but Americans wanted capitalism, and Americans wanted capitalism, and God came in there and liked capitalism.
Communists were secular,
Yeah,
Americans were Christians.
And it was. And so under Eisenhower, Congress passed the legislation which put "In God We Trust,"
And that's
and under God, in the Pledge of Allegiance.
That was in the
That was in the 50s.
Yeah, wow. Okay, so that's
So Cruz says that he kind of dates this phenomena of putting a large degree of religion into American public life in the 50s with this introduction of under God in the Pledge of Allegiance and In God We Trust onto the currency.
And actually, the image of atheists as bad people comes with the Soviet Union being officially atheist.
Yeah, it's funny, when I was growing up, the phrase "godless communist," that was the negative moniker, and so the godless thing really got nailed. Nick.
Just a comment about Bernie Sanders, I mean, don't you think he gets something of a free pass in the sense he's not scary because he comes from a immediately recognizable cultural tradition, which is Abrahamic of origin, so he gets a pass. So I was thinking about, in this context, Julia Gillard, who was the Prime Minister of Australia, who said, I'm an atheist. And it never was an issue there, but she became Prime Minister. But there's something much more scary about saying, I'm an atheist or secular humanist, than somebody who comes from a completely recognizable, non-threatening cultural tradition in that respect.
That may be.
I totally agree with that.
Yeah.
I think because he's a Jew, and people are familiar with the idea of a secular Jew, and they still think even though he's secular, he has those Old Testament, genes running through him. I think he gets away with it more than if he had been a Christian who was called himself a secular
Yeah,
person.
you've got no hope basically.
That's so interesting, because I think it's because he speaks prophetically.
That's because he's a secular Jew.
That's because he's a good person, for crying out loud. I think it's because he said, I actually, right before I ran over, I just printed out a list of I just printed out Bernie Sanders, on the issues, and I didn't hold the thing, these were just the headings. Bernie Sanders' top issue, income and wealth inequality. Getting big money out of politics. Creating decent paying jobs. Now, you can say well, this is everybody's, but I promise you, this wasn't Mitt Romney's. When he was running, income and wealth inequality was not a big issue. Climate change and the environment, a living wage, racial justice, a fair, humane immigration policy. This guy's running on idealism more than any other candidate in the race. I think that's why he gets a pass. You think it's because he's a Jew?
I think it's because he's not.
I thought what? Don't you people believe in anti-Semitism anymore? It's still out there.
Yeah, the polls say that most people like Jews more than anyone else.
Really?
Yes, Jews are very popular.
For in a
No, just as like their friends.
Really? Okay. Really, people like Jews.
Yes, I mean they like them more than they like, right-wing Christians or Muslims or atheists or, given a choice of
Okay.
That's
a good point.
Shares my values is one of the political litmus tests, and Bernie will score high on that, just because of the background. You would be in a murkier territory, I think.
That's
Yes.
so interesting. Okay, so you think a lapsed Christian would be...
Well, somebody who's just an atheist.
Yeah, because if you're a lapsed Christian, you're like a
shares my values
turncoat.
are screwed.
Yes, and I think that's a good point too, because 70% of the country is still Christian. So if you ran for president as a secular Christian, they think of you as a turncoat. 2% of the country is Jewish, so it's not like he's letting anybody down.
Yeah, and again, being a secular Jew, you haven't let down religious Jews.
No.
They're not mad at you. They're not. I mean, you're maybe wrong, but they're not mad at you. You trust me. You leave Christianity. Some people, they're not so much angry; they're just really sad and disappointed, and they let you know it at every turn. And they wouldn't vote for you. That's a great point. Yes, Glenn.
This is kind of a side question, but thank you for this great interchange. But all of a sudden, I find myself really interested in Obama's mama, which I wasn't paying. So I wanted to just ask you this: from the description, it sounded like she was the kind of person that sees some truth and value in a wide range of traditions, faiths, religions, and would have appreciated even secular humanism. But I wonder if she was really a secular humanist or if she was like a pluralistic supernaturalist or something. So is there a line there that's important to draw?
As a secular humanist, what I'll say is, I think that what you're saying is she was a secular humanist, but she saw value in other religious traditions to the degree to which they promoted her values. And I would say that, when I talk to the secular students at USC, especially the ones that are organized, that are connected, they're very secular, but they're very open to talking with religious people about and interacting with religious people. So they're not out to they see value in other people's religious lives, even though they might not agree with their narrative. They see value, and I think that that's one of the hallmarks, and I think that's what Bernie Sanders does when he gets up and he says, all the traditions of the world teach this stuff. What he's saying is like, I see value here, I see value here, I see value here. On what basis does he see value? To the degree to which, I mean, if he was saying like, this religion teaches slavery, I don't think he would be lauding it. He values religions to the degree to which they promote they promote the common good. And so I think that would be like almost the definition of the last of the great secular humanists. There's one other thing I want to make sure we talk about. It's not Bernie at this moment, but it's somebody who also is running, Ben Carson. I don't know if you're familiar with Ben Carson. He's the Seventh-day Adventist neurosurgeon. Ben Carson went on the record as saying, I don't think a Muslim should be president of the United States. Did any of you see that quote? And I'd be really curious to know what you think of that, and what you think of that, because my question is, I think what he really probably meant was, I wouldn't want a Muslim who takes Islam seriously to be the president of the United States. You know? Now the question is, would you want a Christian? Because what my immediate thought was, oh Ben, in the same way that you wouldn't want a serious Muslim to be president, you think that would be against the Constitution? I promise you, if somebody takes the Bible seriously, they would violate the Constitution. I don't want a serious Christian to be president. And so I realized that what Americans really want is they want somebody who's Christian or religious, but not really. Like, they want you to say you're religious, but they don't want you to be really serious about it. If you were really serious about it, they would have as much problem with you as Ben Carson has with Muslims. Or do you think do you think that's what he was driving at?
Well, I think, he walked his original quote back, and so he said it's not that he doesn't want a Muslim to be president, it's not so much being a Muslim, it's being a Muslim who takes Islam
Muslim fundamentals.
very, well, just because you follow Sharia doesn't mean you're a fundamentalist, it means that you are an observant Muslim. So, Americans are of two minds on this. In most surveys, they have said in the past that they want a president who thinks about religion and takes religion into concern when they develop policy statements. Young people your age don't want that so much. So that's a real interesting break with the older generation who did want someone who had religious values and prayed to God and thought about religion before making a policy decision. So
yeah, because I don't even want an airplane pilot I don't want an airplane pilot that takes God seriously when he's trying to land the plane. It was like, I'm going to pray and be led by the Holy Spirit. I want somebody, in that moment, I want somebody secular.
Well, you could drive a plane and still pray to God.
Yeah, I just don't want you listening to God. I don't mind you talking. But do you know what I mean? Like, that when people, one of the basic claims of most religions is that you can in some sense be guided by the still small voice, that you can somehow be guided by the word of God or by the teachings of the faith. And I would say, like, many of those teachings aren't rational teachings. And so, like, I don't mind them when they guide people's moral values in a good direction. But when they come to like science, when they come to like actually making determinations about like, do we drill here? Do we steer the plane this way? I don't want people taking supernaturalism into account. In like when we're doing medicine. Does that make sense?
Yes, it makes sense, but I mean, to some extent, why you're saying some religious values are good and some religious values aren't good. So when Bernie Sanders, invokes the prophets to say he's against income inequality and he's for climate change, that's good. But if someone else invokes the Bible to say they don't believe in abortion or homosexuality, that's bad.
Right.
And so that's when, our friends on the other side of the political fence can say we're being hypocritical because we're picking and choosing which kinds of religion.
Yeah, I just want to like come up with like what's reasonable and scientifically supported, and then go like, to the degree that you find Bible verses that agree with that, those are good Bible verses. But whenever your Bible verse contradicts like reasonable policy, then I'm like, I wouldn't want you to sort of contravene. So it's like, I mean, when Ben Carson said, I wouldn't want a Muslim who practices Sharia law to be president, I was sort of like, I wouldn't either. Like, his first comment seemed to be hyper anti-Islamic, like sort of Islamophobic. But when he said, like, I just don't want you actually applying your religion to the practice of government, I go like, and Ben, when you get elected, I don't want you applying your religion to the practice of government either.
Well, but partly the reason Carson said that was because he believes it's a Christian nation, so he wants someone who can apply Christianity to it to be the president, right?
You think that's what he meant?
Yes. Yes, I think he would. I mean,
he believes that the American Constitution lines up with Christian values.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah, I mean, I think you're right, but doesn't that somewhat alarm you?
Well, yes, it alarms me, but I'm not surprised by it because I think all the Republican candidates believe that America is basically a Christian nation.
Including Donald Trump. No, I mean, the Bible is his favorite book. He just won't be able to tell you a single verse that he actually knows.
I saw a great clip online of him being blessed by Pentecostal pastors.
Really?
Yeah. You could Google Trump and Pentecostal.
I'll come out there. I have to say, like, I'm fascinated by American evangelicals' embrace of Trump, but failure to embrace Bernie Sanders.
But why?
Well, because Trump is, and if there are Trumpers out there, like, I know it's easy to poke fun at Trump and anyone that supports Trump, and I don't want to poke fun at people that support Trump, but or Trump himself. But I think that when it comes to his religious stance, his statement that the Bible is his favorite book, and that in a sense he's sort of saying, I'm guided by Christian values myself, it seems patently disingenuous against the rest of his biography. And so, when Bernie Sanders is invoking religious, like sort of inspirational language, it's very different than that.
But there's a stream of Christianity that believes if you're a good person, you do well, and God gives you success and money, and I mean, he fits right into that.
And so, and I guess what I'm wondering is, like, so I have not seen the evangelical community respond to Bernie's prophetic language.
No, they respond to Trump's gospel of wealth.
And so, do you think that says more about the state of American evangelicalism than it does about those candidates?
Yeah.
Okay, all right.
I have a question for you.
Wait.
Okay.
I'm going to come here because you haven't asked one, then I'm going to come to you, and then I'll go back there, okay? And then I'll come to you, I promise.
I'm just curious where you think we are now. I know that's sort of what this discussion's been all about, but starting as a Christian nation, and like, how has this worked on sort of the spectrum and timeline of religiosity in America, and where we're at now?
Well,
Could you repeat the question, please?
the question was, if
Where are we in this country religiously? Like, in the census campaign, what does it tell us about the state of American religion, religiosity? You know more about that than me.
we are a less Christian country than we have been in the past. Whereas 25 or 30 years ago, over 90% of Americans would have said they were Christian. Today, 70% do. Now, what does that mean? I mean, does it mean that people are being more honest with pollsters today than they were 25 years ago? That's true. And what does it mean to be a Christian? I mean, people have very different ideas of what that is. So it's hard to say exactly where we are as a Christian nation. I would say that because we have become more diverse, and because we have become a more expansive and accepting society in some ways. We are much less publicly religious than we were in the past. And as someone pointed out before, I mean, this was a de facto Christian nation in ways that we can't even imagine in the past. So, you know, the fact Sunday laws are Christian laws. The fact that you can't buy liquor on Sunday in some places is still a Christian law. All school books were basically Christian texts until the late 19th century. So in many ways, the ways in which Christianity was woven into our educational system, our social life, our cultural life is very different today than it was 100 years ago or 200 years ago. So I think in some ways you could make the case that we are a much less Christian nation today than we were in the past. But by all objective measures, we are one of the most Christian nations in the world. Still.
We used to be more.
But, you know,
We're still way up there.
pollsters say of all the industrialized, wealthy nations, America is the most religious.
I'm going to give you a category that I think many of the people, that your friends here at USC probably fall into. It's a category that's growing, the fastest growing religious designation in America is called the people who designate themselves as spiritual but not religious. And I think that spiritual but not religious doesn't necessarily mean woo-woo, like supernatural but not religious, although there's that's a category. But I think when people are talking about spirituality, they're talking about the same things that are driving the Bernie Sanders scale. I don't mean to drive Bernie Sanders, but what I'm saying is that when people are talking about justice, when people are talking about compassion, when people are talking about transcendence, when they're talking about like going out into nature and seeing things that make them feel connected to other people, the brotherhood of man or the sisterhood of man. When this stuff is happening, this is a kind of a form of secular spirituality. On this campus, the mindfulness movement, there are all these people meditating, doing basically secularized Buddhism, right? Most of these people are not, there's no theological content, there's no supernaturalism. They are spiritual, but they are not religious. And so what I would say is that that's the fastest growing thing happening out there. And I think as presidential candidates, whether you claim to be a Christian, like Obama, or whether you're a secular Jew, like Bernie Sanders, you're going to have to speak in spiritual language in order to motivate people. Now, I got to tell you something. Like, I would say to Richard Dawkins, dude, if you want to build a bigger secular movement, you better learn to speak in spiritual terms, too. Sam Harris has gotten pretty good at that lately, right? Like, you better learn to appeal to the part of people that says, I think this world is material, but I don't think material things are all that matter. Love, compassion, brotherhood, like connection, transcendence, doing things that matter after I die, even though I won't be there. All of those things are spiritual values. And I think that, like, the secular humanist world will succeed to the degree that, like a political candidate, it learns to speak to the spiritual urges in people without requiring them to believe supernatural stuff to get it.
Yes, that's all well and good, but the truth of the matter is that huge numbers, maybe one of you knows the statistics, but like 85-90% of Americans believe in heaven and hell. More people believe in heaven and hell and God and angels and all this supernatural stuff than say they're Christian.
Diane's talking about. Where we're going? Okay, back there. And then back there, and then coming down here. And then we're done. Because, I think we're way over. We promised you it would be an hour, and we are an hour. And so you can legitimately walk out right now and not feel like you're a bad person. But we'll go about 5 more minutes if you want to, really be awesome.
I'm really excited for the next event like this because this has been a fascinating discussion. I just wanted to make a suggestion for the next time that it might be wise to start off with a definition of what is religion and what is secularism, because I think that's a very important thing in this. And if I may share just briefly, I don't think supernaturalism is a necessary part of religion, even though I am a supernatural Catholic. But by my view, I agree with Dr. Stoney that religion tends to deals with questions of right and wrong, deals with the ultimate reality, and has social implications. And by that measure, secular humanism is just as religious as any of these other ones. And modern liberalism, Reaganite cult conservatism, all environmentalism of various sorts, all is functionally a religion in what it does to its followers and what its followers believe. And I think that's a perspective that the religious right would disagree with, but as a scholar of religion and society, it would be a more subjective look at the various dynamics going around. So I just thought that.
No, thank you, that's great.
You know, the funny thing about that comment, though, which is extremely important and a good idea, is that I'm in the religion department as well as Annenberg, and that's something that we religion scholars can't agree on. I mean, no one knows what religion is anymore, and the smartest person I know is a professor at Princeton. I said to her, you know, what do you tell your students religion is these days? And she says, I say it's conviction. And I started like looking at her like, conviction?
That's the best you can do.
That's the best you can do? And she said yes, because the term has become so overused and stretched that I think you need to start small with it again. And I used to use a definition more like yours in my class, and I tend to go back there because I do think that's a good overall summary of it. But it would be interesting, probably not for Bart as a secular humanist, to have a discussion on what religion is, but maybe we should tell Varun to do it.
I believe that secular, we're not here to sell secular humanism to you, although we are selling. I don't think secular humanism will thrive unless it is understood in the pantheon of religion.
Well, that's why.
That's why I appreciated what you said. Like, I really, like you said, Bart probably wouldn't be interested in definition of religion. I am, because I want to make sure that whatever definition of religion you come up with, I'm in it. Not, you know, like, we all know what distinguishes me from the vast majority of religions, and, you know, but what I, and that's what makes me the same as everybody. But what unites me with the vast pantheon of religion are those questions and these values and the sense that goodness doesn't just happen, that it has to be cultivated, and that it tends to be cultivated in the context of communities that are value driven. Yeah. Okay, back there, and then go quick.
I think the obvious, but I do feel like the concept of religion in the American political climate is not really about religion, but something else. I'll just give the example of Islam. For an ideological clash, the only things so-called, the critics of Muslims we talk about are Sharia law and jihad, and that's about it, which seems like an incredibly weak ideological argument. Because you can see that these Islamophobes, actually, they don't actually so much criticize the tenets of Islam, but they have an ethnic hatred of Arabs. I'll give you an example. In the 2008 campaign, John McCain, a woman said, I won't vote for Obama, not because he's not a Muslim, because he's an Arab. Deliciously ignoring the fact that in the Arabic region, you have the oldest sects of Christianity, like the Coptic Syrians. I'll give you another example. After 9/11, a few years back, a crazed gunman killed a couple of Sikhs in a Sikh temple. Even though Sikh is a religion that is not related to Islam, but because they wore beards and wore turbans, they were Muslims, in a sense. So I'll just leave you with a question. Let's just say in a plane, a woman wearing a hijab is sitting next to you. Probably a lot of people would feel uncomfortable. But let's just say if there were a Malaysian Chinese Muslim, and there are a lot of them in Malaysia, who are wearing normal clothes, you protest.
Thank you.
It's interesting because many Americans have gone to the point where we dislike people for who they are. I can see disliking someone for what they do, but not who they are. Because you don't know who and when I say who they are, I mean because they're a Muslim or because they're a Jew or because they're gay, by their identity, their identity. And I think that's part of the problem we have, is that we're judging people because we say you're this or you're that, and they may be wonderful people who do fine things and are very nice to sit next to on a plane, and we don't even get that far because we make snap judgments based on their hijab or their yarmulke or their skin color.
And you know, that may be a good place to, I just want to say one last thing. I just got a note from the Interfaith Council here at USC, inviting the Secular Student Fellowship to participate in the Interfaith Conference. A bunch of people from a bunch of different campuses coming here to USC in November, I think the second Saturday in November. And we'll go, and it'll be beautiful, because I think that the very thing that you guys are talking about, the only real antidote that we have for some of this identity politics and frankly identity relationship problems on our campus is interaction and engagement. And so that's where we got to go. So we're going to wrap it up there. Thank you all so much for indulging this conversation. I hope it's been helpful to you. Look forward to talking to you later.